In the small town of Monteverde, a fine mist lay over the streets at dawn. It was a quiet place where everyone knew each other, but on this day something disrupted the routine. A dog appeared, its fur matted with visible scars on its back and paws, like battle marks no one could explain. The old collar it wore had no identification, only a strange detail, a rusted metal emblem with initials that had almost faded away. At first, the dog wandered aimlessly, startling the residents with its intense gaze and defensive posture. But soon it became clear that it wasn't lost. It was following a specific child, 8-year-old Julia, the daughter of a couple who had moved to town a few months earlier. Julia first noticed the dog while playing with friends in the town square. It stood still, as if watching her. Over the days, the animal began to follow her, always keeping a certain distance. At first, the girl was scared, but when she realized the dog wasn't making any aggressive moves, curiosity won out. "Mom, there's a dog following me," Julia said one evening as her mother washed the dishes. "He probably just wants food, sweetie. Ignore him, and he'll go away," her mother replied distractedly. But the dog didn't leave. On the contrary, it seemed to protect her. Once, when a stranger approached her at the market, the dog growled so fiercely that the man backed away. This behavior piqued Julia's interest. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. One evening after school, Julia decided to confront her follower. "Hey dog, why are you following me?" she asked with a mix of defiance and innocence. The dog tilted its head as if understanding the question and let out a single, hoarse bark. Then it began to walk toward the edge of town, stopping every few meters to look back, as if urging her to follow. Julia hesitated. The idea seemed crazy, but something in the dog's demeanor conveyed urgency. Bravely, she followed it through the deserted streets until they reached an abandoned barn overgrown with ivy, its walls lined with loose boards. "What do you want to show me?" Julia murmured, her heart racing. The dog barked again and began digging near a haystack. Its determination was impressive, its paws moving the earth with purpose, throwing dust into the air. Julia knelt beside it, watching in fascination. After a few minutes, something metallic emerged from the ground. "Mom's going to kill me if she finds out I was in here," Julia muttered, but she couldn't take her eyes off what the dog was uncovering. When the digging finally revealed an old rusted trunk, the dog stopped, sat beside it, and looked at Julia. Its eyes seemed to wait, as if saying, "Now it's your turn." Julia touched the rough surface of the trunk, feeling adrenaline pulse through her veins. What could be inside? And why had the dog insisted on leading her here? The question swirled, leaving a trace of nervousness in the quiet barn. Unsure what to do, Julia quickly stood up and ran home, her heart racing and her hands dirty. She had to tell someone. But who? And more importantly, who was this dog that seemed to know her better than she knew herself? When she got home, Julia burst through the door, stumbling over her words. "Mom, Dad, you have to see something." "Julia, calm down. What's going on?" her mother asked, dropping the dish towel on the table. "A dog led me to the old barn. It dug up a chest, a real chest." Julia's father, sitting on the couch reading the newspaper, frowned. "What did I tell you about going to that part of town? It's dangerous. There could be old, rusty things. Or worse. But Dad, this is serious. The dog knew where to dig. It knew something was there. Please, you have to see it." The urgency in Julia's voice made her parents exchange a knowing look. They knew Julia had a vivid imagination, but this story felt different. "All right, we'll take a look," her father sighed, standing up. "But if it's just a pile of nonsense, you're grounded for disobedience." A few minutes later, the family retraced Julia's steps. The dog was still there, lying like a loyal guardian beside the trunk. When it saw Julia approaching, it stood up and wagged its tail, but its eyes remained watchful. "There it is," Julia said, pointing to the partially unearthed trunk. Her father approached cautiously, examining the object. It was old. Much of the metal rusted, and part of the side had broken off, revealing what looked like a lock. "Well, this doesn't look like a joke," he muttered. "I'll need help to open this." Determined to solve the mystery, they called the police. When the officers arrived, the area was quickly cordoned off. Julia watched intently as they examined the chest. Looks like it's been buried for years, one officer said. But why would someone do that? With specialized tools, the officers finally opened the trunk. As the lid creaked open, everyone held their breath. Inside was a macabre collection of items. Faded photos, yellowed documents, and detailed maps, all enveloped by a strong smell of mildew and rust. Julia stepped forward curiously. "Hey, stay behind the tape," one officer warned, blocking her view. The officers began to seriously examine the contents. Among the papers were detailed records of places, dates, and names. At the bottom of the trunk, a stack of photos stood out. Some showed people in unknown locations. Others featured maps with hand-drawn markings. But there was something even more unsettling. A series of documents listing the names of missing persons, all cases that had been filed at the local police station. The police chief, who had just arrived, looked at Julia's parents. "This is bigger than it seems. We'll need a thorough investigation." Julia's father, visibly uncomfortable, asked, "What does all this mean?" The officer hesitated before answering. "We don't know yet, but from what I can see, this trunk belonged to someone with dark intentions." As the adults talked, Julia whispered to herself, "I knew the dog wanted to tell me something." The dog, sitting calmly at a distance, seemed to understand every word. It stared at the officers as if waiting for them to discover something important. Later that evening at home, Julia felt the story was far from over. The dog was no ordinary mutt, and the trunk seemed to hold a secret that connected all the recent events. The next morning, the small town of Monteverde was abuzz with excitement. The trunk found in the barn had become the main topic, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was an old smuggler's hideout, others that it belonged to a murderer who had never been caught. But Julia couldn't get the photos and documents she had briefly seen out of her head. At breakfast, she insisted, "Mom, I want to know what was in the trunk. Will they talk about it on the news?" "Julia, they're investigating. If there's something to tell, they will. And you, young lady, will stay away from abandoned barns, understood?" Her mother replied, cutting a piece of toast. Julia nodded reluctantly, but when the police returned to the barn that afternoon, she ran to watch from a distance. The dog, as always, was nearby, following her like a shadow. On the other side of the tape, the officers scrutinized every item in the trunk. Then something caught their eye, a photo that looked different from the others. As one officer analyzed it, he frowned and called the chief over. "Sir, you need to see this." It was an old black and white photo of a child sitting on a wooden chair, with a hooded figure blurred in the background, as if the photo had been taken in haste. But the child's face made the chief's eyes widen. "This can't be," he muttered, turning to Julia, who was watching from a distance. That night, there was a knock at Julia's door. It was the police chief. Her parents greeted him with concern. "Is there a problem, officer?" her father asked. "I need to speak with you. It's about the trunk," he said, glancing briefly at Julia, who was trying to listen behind the door. "And specifically about your daughter." This prompted a worried exchange of glances between her parents. "What do you mean?" The officer sighed before continuing. "Among the photos found in the trunk, there was one that caught our attention. It's an old picture, and under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be a cause for concern. But the child in the photo looks strikingly like your daughter." "Julia, that doesn't make sense. It must be a coincidence," her father exclaimed, visibly upset. "That's what I thought too. But there's another detail. The photo was taken before Julia was born, at least 20 years earlier, according to the initial analysis." There was a moment of absolute silence. Julia's mother covered her mouth in disbelief. "That's impossible. It must be a mistake." The officer nodded grimly. "We'd like to believe that too. We're sending the photo for forensic analysis, but the connections in this case are becoming increasingly troubling." Before leaving, he added, "Oh, and about the dog. Do you have any idea where it came from?" Julia's parents looked at each other, confused. "It just showed up. Why?" "There's something strange about it too. We have old reports of a very similar dog being seen at the barn years ago during an investigation that never led anywhere. It's as if it's been waiting for something." Later that evening, as her parents whispered in the living room, Julia examined the photo the officer had left on the table. Indeed, the girl in the picture looked eerily like her. But how could that be? In her bedroom, the dog lay beside her bed like a vigilant protector. Julia stroked its head and whispered, "What's going on?" "You know, don't you?" The dog looked up, and for a moment Julia felt something unusual. It wasn't just the gaze of a dog, it was as if it was trying to communicate. Suddenly the lights in the house flickered. Julia felt a chill. The dog growled softly, its attention turning to the window. Outside, among the shadows of the trees, she swore she saw a hooded figure standing still, watching her. The night was long and quiet, but in Julia's house nothing was normal. After the strange sighting of the hooded figure, tension hung in the air. The dog remained alert, lifting its head at every small sound, as if expecting something to happen. The next morning, Julia's parents tried to dispel the strange mood. "It was just your imagination, Julia. You've been thinking too much about the trunk and the photos," her father said, trying to reassure her. But it was no use. Julia knew what she had seen, and the dog seemed to know too. It spent the entire night in a defensive stance beside her bed and was still sniffing the air restlessly. Later, the investigators returned to the family's home to share the latest developments. One of the officers, looking visibly concerned, carried a folder full of documents. "Mr. and Mrs. Amaral, our team has examined the items in the trunk more closely. There's something disturbing we need to discuss," he said, placing the folder on the table. Julia's parents exchanged worried glances as the girl looked up from the stairs. "We found records of crimes that took place over 20 years ago, involving child abductions. The dates and locations described match the maps found in the trunk." Julia's mother clutched her chest. "Abductions? But why does this have anything to do with our daughter?" The officer hesitated before continuing. "There's a theory. Based on what we've found, the trunk seems to be some kind of archive used by a criminal believed to be dead. He was known for planning all his crimes in the barn where the trunk was found." Julia's father interrupted, his voice rising. "Are you saying there's a direct connection between this man and our family?" "We're not sure yet, but there's more. Among the photos, we found another one that confirms a strange connection." The officer took an enlarged photo from the folder and handed it over. It showed the dog beside the same barn, but like the other picture, it looked incredibly old. The shocking detail was a man holding a collar identical to the one the dog now wore. This dog belonged to the criminal. It survived the massacre that took place in this barn many years ago when it was set on fire. Since then, the animal has been seen in the area, as if guarding the place. At that moment, a loud noise came from the kitchen. Everyone turned immediately. One of the cabinets had opened by itself, and plates fell to the floor, shattering. "It was the wind," Julia's father said quickly, trying to explain it away. But the dog ran into the kitchen, growling at nothing. Its rigid posture made it clear it sensed something else. "This place is starting to creep me out," the officer muttered. That night, the events grew even stranger. Julia lay in her room trying to sleep when she was awakened by a soft, repetitive sound, like something tapping against the wall. She got up and followed the sound into the hallway, where she found the attic door slightly ajar. The dog appeared beside her, growling softly. "Is someone there?" she asked in a trembling voice. There was no answer, only the persistent tapping. Julia took a deep breath and pulled the cord of the retractable ladder leading to the attic. The dog climbed up first, its protective stance giving her courage. The attic air was thick and damp. The light from Julia's flashlight illuminated walls, covered in cobwebs and dusty boxes. But in one corner, something caught her eye, an old chair with markings similar to those in the photo from the trunk. Suddenly, the flashlight went out. Julia felt panic rising. "What's going on here?" she cried, trying to turn the light back on. The dog barked fiercely, and a loud noise echoed as if something had fallen. In a burst of courage, Julia quickly climbed down and closed the ladder behind her. The dog continued to growl at the ceiling. When she told her parents, they grew even more worried. Her mother suggested they all sleep in one bed that night, while her father reinforced the locks in the house. But Julia knew it wouldn't end so quickly. She went over to the dog, who was lying by the front door, and hugged it tightly. "You know what's happening here, don't you?" "Help me understand," she whispered. The dog, of course, didn't answer, but the intensity in its eyes made Julia believe it was there to protect her from something far greater than she could comprehend. The early morning in Monteverde was marked by an unusual, oppressive silence, as if the town itself sensed danger. Everyone in Julia's house was asleep, or trying to be. The dog, however, remained awake, standing motionless by the door, ears alert and gaze fixed on the darkness of the room. Around 3 a.m., a soft sound broke the silence, the sound of footsteps outside, light and cautious. The dog growled softly, deep enough to wake Julia in her room. She sat up in bed, feeling the familiar shiver run down her spine. "Is someone there?" she whispered into the void, but she knew she wasn't alone. On the other side of the corridor, her parents were also awake. Her father peered through the living room window with a flashlight in hand. "I can't see anything," he murmured, but his voice wavered. The dog began to bark wildly as if something nearby was provoking it. When her father opened the door to look, a stone was hurled from the darkness, hitting the wall with a dull thud. "Who's there?" he called, trying to stay calm. There was no answer, only the sound of footsteps quickly retreating. He closed the door again, but the dog was still restless, barking at the window. The next morning, muddy footprints were visible on the windows and doors of the house. Human footprints. It was clear someone had been prowling around. The police were called again, and the police chief soon arrived, his expression even grimmer than before. "This confirms what we feared," he said as he examined the footprints. "The criminal we thought was dead is alive, and he's trying to find the contents of the trunk." Julia's parents exchanged alarmed glances. "But why would he threaten us?" "We haven't taken anything from the trunk. It's all with you," her mother said, trying to hide her nervousness. "Maybe he thinks you know more than you do," the officer replied. "Or maybe he wants to silence the witnesses." That last sentence hit Julia like a blow. She didn't know what was worse, the fear of what might happen, or the feeling that all of this was connected to her in a way she still couldn't understand. That afternoon, as the police increased security around the house, Julia stayed in the yard with the dog. In the sunlight, it seemed calmer, but it kept an eye on its surroundings, frequently sniffing the air. "You're protecting me, aren't you?" Julia said, kneeling beside it. The dog tilted its head as if it understood. Suddenly, something on the ground caught its attention. It began digging frantically near a tree. "Hey, what are you doing?" Julia asked, but she didn't try to stop it. After a few minutes, the dog unearthed a small, dirty object, a metal keychain with a symbol that looked familiar. Julia picked it up, cleaned it, and tried to recognize the pattern. "This was in the trunk," she murmured, remembering one of the maps she had briefly seen when the police were examining the documents. The symbol marked a specific location. She ran to show it to her parents and the police chief. "Where did you find this?" the police chief asked, holding the keychain carefully. "The dog dug it up near the tree. I think it's trying to show us something." The deputy seemed to consider for a moment before sighing. "We'll have to look into this. If the criminal is still alive, he might have left more clues." That night, as everyone tried to get ready for bed, the dog remained restless. Around 11 p.m., a noise from the backyard caught their attention. Footsteps again, but this time they weren't trying to be quiet. Julia's father ran into the living room and saw a large hooded shadow pass by the window. Before he could react, the figure tried to force open the back door. "Call the police!" he shouted to his wife as he grabbed a piece of wood for protection. The dog shot toward the back door, barking wildly. The figure hesitated but didn't retreat. The hooded man raised something metallic, a rod, as if to attack the dog. Suddenly, sirens blared on the street. The figure hesitated for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness of the yard and ran through the trees. When the police arrived, the deputy was visibly irritated. "He's getting bold. That means he's desperate," he said, inspecting the damage to the lock. "We need to end this before someone gets hurt." At that moment, the dog began barking toward the nearby woods. It took a few steps toward the trees, then looked back as if urging them to follow. "I think it's found something," Julia said, already preparing to follow the animal. "No, Julia, you stay here," her father ordered. But the deputy seemed convinced. "Let's follow it. This dog has already proven it knows more than we do." With flashlights in hand, the group followed the dog through the woods. The air was cool and tense. After a few minutes, the dog stopped in a clearing and began digging again. What it would uncover next could change everything. The darkness of the forest seemed alive, the sounds of the night mingling with the rustling of leaves under the hurried footsteps of Julia, her parents, the deputy, and the officers. The dog led the way, its trail swift and determined. In the clearing, it stopped. The light from the lanterns illuminated the spot where it began to dig once more. "What is it looking for?" Julia's father asked in a hushed, tense voice. The dog uncovered an old, partially buried piece of wood. One of the officers approached and carefully pushed the earth aside. When he finally revealed what was buried, everyone held their breath. A rusty hatch, hidden under the forest floor for years. "Looks like a trap door," the officer said, bending down to examine it. With effort, the officers opened the hatch. A strong smell of dampness and decay wafted out, followed by a collective shiver. Below was a metal staircase leading to an underground cellar. "Stay here. Let us go down first," the deputy ordered Julia's parents. But she didn't obey. "I'm going down. He brought me here for a reason," Julia said, pointing to the dog, which growled and headed toward the opening. "Julia, this is dangerous," her mother protested. The deputy hesitated for a moment, but seeing the determination in the girl's eyes, he relented. "All right, but stay behind me and don't touch anything." The cellar was cold and dark, the concrete walls covered in moss. On the floor lay scraps of paper, broken bottles, and something that made Julia shudder, a pair of rusty handcuffs attached to a wall. "This looks like a hideout," one officer said, scanning the area with his flashlight. In the back corner stood a table with more papers scattered across it. One of them bore the same symbol as the keychain. Another was a map with a detailed route through the town. "This place was used recently," the deputy said, picking up one of the papers. "He's alive. He was here." Before they could react, heavy, determined footsteps were heard above them. The dog began barking and growling toward the staircase. "Someone's here," Julia exclaimed, her heart racing. Suddenly, the hatch slammed shut. One of the officers tried to push it open, but it seemed to be locked from the outside. "We're trapped," he shouted. As they struggled to open the hatch, a deep voice echoed from outside. "You shouldn't have touched what doesn't belong to you." It was the hooded man. Even without seeing him, the cold authority in his voice sent shivers down everyone's spines. "Who are you? What do you want?" the deputy shouted. "I just want what's mine. The trunk, the documents, and silence from all of you." Julia felt the dog press against her, as if protecting her. She couldn't see the man, but she felt his presence like a heavy shadow hanging over the place. "You won't escape this time," the deputy called out. The man let out a low, eerie laugh. "We'll see about that." The sound of dragging wood echoed, followed by a liquid pouring through the hatch. A strong smell of gasoline filled the air. "He's going to burn us alive," one officer screamed in panic. Outside, rapid footsteps were heard, followed by wild barking. Another group of police officers, alerted by the deputy's emergency call, arrived at the scene. The hooded man tried to flee, but the dog charged at him with impressive fury. The criminal staggered and fell as the dog knocked him to the ground. One officer seized the moment to arrest him, while the others opened the hatch and freed the group in the cellar. Julia rushed up the stairs, greeted by the cool night air and the sight of the man in handcuffs. He was older than she had imagined, but his cold, calculating eyes looked like those of a predator. "It's over," the deputy said as the officers escorted the man to the car. But the man turned to Julia, his gaze fixed on her. "This isn't the end. You'll see." Julia felt the words like a punch to the gut, but the dog, always by her side, growled softly, as if promising to protect her from whatever was to come. The following days in Monteverde were marked by a mix of relief and unease. The perpetrator, identified as Alfredo Venturi, a former kidnapper declared dead, was taken into custody. The documents found in the hideout linked him to old crimes and a network of abductions that had never been solved. Julia, however, couldn't forget Alfredo's cold stare and his final words. There was something she still didn't understand, but the dog remained by her side, a constant source of security. Over the weeks, the dog officially became part of the family and was named Max. It earned the title of a local hero, but to Julia, it was more than that. It was a friend who had guided her family through the darkness and protected what mattered most. The connection between Julia, Max, and the dark past of the trunk was never fully explained. The photo of the girl who looked identical to Julia before her birth was dismissed as a strange coincidence, with no concrete evidence of anything supernatural. The barn was demolished, and many believed the land was cursed. Still, the town slowly returned to normal. One night, as Julia petted Max, she looked up at the starry sky and whispered, "Thank you for being with me." The dog stared at her with eyes that seemed to contain a million stories. As long as it stayed by her side, Julia knew she would be safe, no matter what the future held. And so, the mark of the past was buried but never forgotten. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.